here we are as a country bemoaning the psychological state of our youth, the amount of mass shootings that we deal with, the suicide rates, all the troubles that we have. And yet, what are we doing? We're asking authors to make their stories darker and angrier and more violent. We're feeding it. And then we're so shocked when our children who we have fed this terrible food are dying from it.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Rae. Welcome to another episode of the Caldron Pool Show. Today, I'm incredibly excited to have Christine Cohen here. She is an author and an incredible one at that. And I wanted to have her on the show because she has got some amazing books that I would personally love to recommend you have in your bookshelves, in your home, as an adult, especially for your children. But I think it's really important that we take an interest in literature, especially for our kids. And that's part of the reason I wanted to have her on. But before I dive into all of that meatier stuff, thank you for joining me today. And would you be willing to give a little bit of a bio about yourself for any of the viewers who might be listening who aren't familiar with your work?
Okay, yes, thank you for having me on. My name is Christine Cohen, and I have written 2 books so far. The first one is called The Winter King, and the second one is called The Sinking City. I'm a mother and a wife to 3 young children, and I live in Idaho, as you can tell from my lack of an accent, I guess, or maybe my North Idaho accent. I'm also the director of the MFA program, which is the Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing at New St. Andrews College. And did you want me to talk about my books a little bit, explain the plot of them, or?
I would love, yeah. So I think from what I remember, The Winter King was the first book that you wrote.
Yes.
Please, I would love for you to explain, the plot and the storyline of that book. That'd be
Sure.
amazing.
Yes. So the Winter King, it came out in 2019, and I'd written it several years before. So what happened was I've loved writing stories since I was little, and I wrote a lot of really derivative Lord of the Rings fan fiction when I was a teenager. So that was the time when I realized this was something I wanted to do, because while all my friends in the summer were off playing sports outside, I was locked in my room with my computer typing out trilogies about hobbits and elves and dwarves, and I just loved it. And then I went to New St. Andrews College myself. I went through the undergraduate program, and I got married. And shortly after that, we welcomed our first baby, and we moved to a new city. We were I didn't know anybody. My husband got a job there, and we had a 3-month-old who took 2 2-hour naps a day. And I had a very small apartment that I could clean in 25 minutes. And so then I looked around and thought, okay, well, what do I do with my time? And I remembered how much I loved writing. So I just picked it up again and started trying to get some words on a paper. And I wrote a really awful manuscript, which I think I maybe even sent to my mom, because I was like, look what I've done. And she was, she was as impressed as mothers are, but was sort of like, yeah, this could use some work. So I threw that one away. And then I wrote another manuscript, which was less awful. And then I think by that point, we actually had 2 children. I was still just kind of plugging away, working at my craft. And then I heard about something called National Novel Writing Month, which is the month of November. A lot of writers do it, where they try to get 40,000 words, I think, written in 1 month. So basically, you're trying to write the first draft of a novel. And I thought, I'm terribly morning sick with our 3rd child. I might as well do this to distract myself. So I started The Winter King. And at the time, I had I wasn't outlining at that point. I just had some vague ideas of what I thought I wanted to write about. So I knew that I wanted to write a story about a village. And in my mind, I could see it. It was like a Nordic village trapped in sort of surrounded on 3 sides by fjords, and then a mountain range on the 4th side. And so very isolated. It's sort of late middle or early Middle Ages, and kind of Viking-esque. And I wanted to write about a religion there that had essentially just been warped or twisted. And a girl who's a part of this village and is feeling the fear, both of kind of the winter that's around her and also this, what feels like a very oppressive religion. So that was, from the get-go, that was kind of the idea I had. And so I started writing it on November 1st and I finished it right at the end. And it was just awful. I mean, it was, once again, although this one I sent to my mother and she goes, okay, I think you have something here. Like she was excited about that one and I was excited. So by then I knew what I was doing more. I knew how to write a beginning, middle, and end, how to give my characters an arc. And so I just started revising it, going back over it and figuring out what worked and what didn't. I sent it to some early readers and they gave me feedback and then I actually ended up, what's interesting is, so that one is, I don't know if Australia has the same age categories for children's books that the US does, but in the US we have middle grade books, which are for 8 to 12-year-olds. And then we have young adult, which is for 13 to 18. And so because my main character was 16, because there was just a very slight romance in it, she's in a Viking village and she's 16 years old. So of course she's at marriageable age. So because of those things, it's considered young adults. So I ended up signing with a New York agent for that book, which is really exciting. And we worked on it some more, did more edits, and then we sent it out to the editors at the publishing houses. And consistently the feedback we got was, this is lovely, but it's not old enough for young adults. And by that, what they meant was it was not, it wasn't checking the boxes that they had in their mind for what teens wanted to read, which was, it didn't have either explicit scenes or at least implied intimacy. It didn't have LGBTQ plus representation. It didn't have, it was not checking any of these boxes. I myself was not a person of color. Like there wasn't anything that they were like, oh, this is following the zeitgeist that we're a part of. And so we just couldn't get any bites on it. And it was discouraging to me, particularly because I knew, having been a 14, 15-year-old at one point, that this is a book that they would love to read. And that I even have heard from parents of non-Christian kids that they're like, we don't want to give our kids really graphic material, and so it's like, what do you give someone who is, if they're 14 years old, they've grown out of middle grade, they don't want to read about a 12-year-old anymore, but they're either not ready or just shouldn't be reading a lot of the material that's out there for young adult. So what books are for them? And so I knew that I didn't want to just change it in some way to fit whatever our culture was demanding. So I ended up I parted ways with my agent, and then I took it to Canon Press, who is my publisher, and they loved it. And I worked again with the editor there, Brian Cole, and we made changes to make it better, but I always knew that these were changes that were actually improving the story and not just checking boxes, so that was how The Winter King came to be. And then after that, I had actually written, while The Winter King was out on submission with editors, while I was waiting, I wrote The Sinking City, which is my second book. So by the time The Winter King came out, I was actually already ready to send my editor at Canon my next one and say, hey, what do you think about this one?
While you're there, look at this one.
Exactly. While I have your attention. And it's been fun because that one is a very different world. So The Winter King, I think it's doing really well. People really seem to enjoy that one. It has a very kind of, like I said, a cold northern feel to it. And it's supposed to feel like a myth, like it has sort of, I'm playing with the myth of Hades and Persephone and the idea of a god who leaves or who's cursed the ground with winter, and that when he returns, spring comes. And so I was playing with kind of a lot of the big monomyths that we know. And then with The Sinking City, I thought, okay, I want to do something just entirely different. Like I want to try something different. It's like giving someone kind of a different palette, to experience Yes. So with that one, it's set in 17th century Venice, and the main character is the daughter of a Venetian nobleman, the patricians. Um, and I should add, it's Venice, but with a twist, because in addition to all the guilds that they had back then, everything
Mm,
was set up on kind of a guild system. There's also a magician's guild. So
okay.
Leona, she's the daughter of a nobleman. She on the eve of her 16th birthday, catastrophe strikes and she's forced to flee her home and disguise herself as a boy and become the assistant to the most notorious magician in Venice. So I was playing with that one. I thought, okay, I want to write something that feels more like a fairy tale, so I set it up with a very fairy tale-esque beginning of like something bad happens at your 16th birthday party.
Yeah.
That's a Sleeping Beauty fairy tale right there.
Yeah.
And then I also was working with like the one of my favorite Shakespearean plays is Twelfth Night. So in that one you have the girl who disguises herself as a boy and all the
Mm.
mischief and mayhem that ensues. So anyway, so that one is supposed to feel much more bright and colorful. I'm dealing with masks and balls and magic, and so it's a fun, I guess, contrast to the first one, but hopefully they still feel like my type of story.
Mm. It's incredible. I love that you were so into fantasy and Tolkien and all of those. I love fantasy. And I think a lot of people do. I think that a lot of people think that they're not cool if they like fantasy, but I think everybody is just in denial. Like, who doesn't love fantasy, dwarfs and elves and dragons and
Right,
mysterious cities with magicians and all of these things? Like, it's just magical. I think it's because there is so much mystery to our God as well, and so many
right.
things that he has kept secret for him. And, he's revealed himself to us in such a way, knowing that our natures are curious and creative. And I love it when you get people who can hone into those things and create amazing stories that fulfill that part of our minds as human beings. So would you say
Yes.
that The Winter King and The Sinking City, your two books,
Mhm.
would they be in the fantasy genre?
Absolutely, yes. So the Winter King is I tend to call them both low fantasy. So high fantasy would be more when you get to really intricate world building and elves and dwarves and different species, and that type of thing is generally considered high fantasy. Usually if it has a map at the beginning of the book, then you're
Yeah.
getting into high fantasy.
Yes.
Low fantasy is generally what I have written so far, which is essentially our world, but with a twist. So it's kind of one
Mm,
step removed from our world. So, and I personally like doing that because it makes it easier for world building. I don't have to come up with an entirely new ecosystem, a
mm.
new commerce and trade and
Language.
understanding language. Exactly. Like there's a lot
Yeah.
that is actually not my favorite part of writing. And so I would rather take something that we already have. But like you said, our world is so magical. Like God has infused it. It is the spoken word, right? So like it's infused with power and majesty. And I think that we are still learning and discovering new things about it, even with our um, the the more that we understand and know about our brains or anything. Actually, I was just listening to
Mm,
a book the other day that was talking about peregrine falcons, and it was saying that their nerve receptors um, transfer information, their optic nerves, from their eyes to their brains 10 times faster than humans. So
mm.
things that we see going really fast, like a dragonfly's wings, go slow to them, which of course allows them to be great predators.
Yeah.
But it's such a fascinating thing to think that like these are people or these are animals that are experiencing the world in a completely different way than we are. Things
Yeah.
are sped up or in slow motion or, like, and
Mm,
that, and I love learning things like that. And so even when I'm writing, like with the Sinking City, the magic in the story, I worked really hard to make it feel like it could just be a natural outworking of the world the way it is. Like maybe in the future we might learn about how to the way we can manipulate certain elements and metals and whatever, like this might be just another thing that God has given us that we should use in accordance with his will and, according to nature. But that isn't evil or bad, so.
Yeah, I think a lot of Christians sometimes, like I know, for example, my parents, they're from that generation where it's just any magic is bad. Stay away from it.
Right.
They don't really have the critical thinking to, I guess, differentiate between good versus evil when it comes to those things. So it was just always don't touch magic, don't do any of those things. But how would
Mm.
you, how would you as an author and as a Christian author navigate presenting fantasy in a good and godly way, as opposed to, some people criticize the Harry Potter, for example, and say
Right.
Christians should avoid that. How do you, and a lot of people say, well, what about Tolkien? He's got wizards and magic.
Right.
So how would you as an author, I guess, steer on the C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, as opposed to other types of fantasy stories? And yeah, how would you navigate through that?
Yeah. So, and it is true that I think sometimes when parents or adults say, "Oh, we magic bad," that idea, we're forgetting again, like I said, the fact that our world is magical. That, like, that though there was a wizard's duel in the Bible, between Moses and the Pharaoh's servants, and so it's
Yes.
like we have plenty of examples of ways that I guess we could call it magic is used. What I think that Lewis and Tolkien understood, and what I also attempt to do in my story, is show that anything that I write into my story has to be in subjection to God, because it is his creation, and there isn't anything that could one up him or that's even on his level. It is all part of the created world. So if I have magic in my stories, which I do specifically in The Sinking City, there are rules about it, because like you cannot create something ex nihilo. So even in Harry Potter, there's times where people are just conjuring something up out of nothing, and it's like, no, that's not the way the world works, because that's God has given us matter, and so you can, again, like the same way that you can melt down metal and create a sword or whatever, like I have magic be something that we can, in the story, these characters can create, but it has to be done in submission and obedience to God. And if it isn't done that way, then it's dark magic, then it's evil. And it's the same thing with Tolkien, with Saruman versus Gandalf, in the way that they are either rebelling against their order or being in submission to it. So that's kind of how I try to look at it. And I do. And the thing is that, I'm creating a fantasy world, so there's going to be differences, but they still need to be, I still can't have like an ethical system that is wrong, or, that's anti-God. Like I couldn't create a fantasy world in which murder was okay. And so there are, of course, there's checks and balances there, but and when we talk to our kids, so my kids have read Harry Potter, and but they also understand, like they have also read the Bible and know that there's parts where it says you shall not permit a sorcerer to live, and there is magicians, and the way that they're shown in Harry Potter, if you were to take that and transpose it into this world, it'd be a real bad thing. Like we can't, they understand that this is fantasy, and that this is a place where the story itself fails. And so I think some of it is just having good open conversations with your kids about it, because I do totally understand the concern with the evils of magic. So
yeah, absolutely. I think it's a real I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think it really depends on the relationship you've fostered and cultivated with your children. And it also is very dependent on, I guess, the individual child as well. I mean, there are certain books that you could probably just throw on any kid's lap and go, it's not going to lead them astray. It's not going to damn them to hell. It's not going to do this. That's great. And then there's books that you would go, my child is never going to touch that. And then there are books where you go, depending on where my child's at, where, as the individual, that's something we can work with a Christian
Right.
lens. So I think dialogue, like you said, conversation, and being involved with your children is
Yes.
really key to, I guess, filtering what they can and can't do. But you
And it's
mentioned,
interesting. Oh,
sorry, you
I was
go.
just gonna say, because actually with the Harry Potter stories, to me, I'm less concerned about my kids going off and, I don't know, filling a cauldron and trying to create some magical potion. And I'm more concerned with them imitating Harry's real bad attitudes towards his friends, and the fact that there's no
Yeah,
seeking of forgiveness, reconciliation, those types of things. So
the
I
moral
actually, when
things
people
in it.
are like,
Yeah.
yeah, when they're like, oh, Harry Potter, I love it. I'm like, yes, there's parts of it that we think are great, but I read them out loud to the kids, and I will pause and be like, okay, so at this point, Harry should have apologized. Hermione should have gone
Yes.
and found a teacher, a responsible adult, and told them what was going on. Like, those are
Yes.
actually the things that I think are more impactful to a kid.
Yeah, the character, like, not as in the
Right.
character, but like their character of their soul and their heart. That's the
Yes.
important meaty stuff. Yeah, Harry's like this spoilt little brat who, thinks he's some sort of godlike wizard because of the history he's had. But yeah, but no, I think I think those are all really important conversations, and I think we take a lot of care with the things we let our children view. Well, you would hope, if you're a good
Hmm.
parent, right, that you're gonna filter what is on the television in your home. You're gonna filter the friends that your children keep. You're gonna filter what church you go to, what school they go to, whether you're gonna be filtering a lot of things. And I think literature is something as well that we as parents should be more hands-on with, and take more of an interest in. Would you suggest, as a parent, that you should be reading books before you give them to your children, or reading with them? Like, how would you navigate that process with yours?
Yes. So for I would say probably 90% of the books that I give to my kids, I've read them. And part of that was I was a voracious reader as a kid. So it's easy for me to,
Mm,
there's still, at least they're still fairly young. So I'm able to grab all the old classics that I read and throw them their direction. And then the other 10% are ones that have come recommended to me by mom friends who I really trust. And
yeah.
particularly when it comes to the younger group, actually, and what you were saying about knowing your child is so true, because there are certain, it's the same thing with movies. There's certain books that I wouldn't hand to my 12-year-old, even though another 12-year-old could read them, because
Mm,
I might know the things that she either would be bothered by, or that would be a bad influence, or whatever. Or a lot of times what it is I try to keep a read on how my kids are doing in terms of, I mean, we all are doing this, and in terms of like their how they're growing and how their minds are being shaped. And so if I know that I have a child who's struggling with thankfulness, maybe, then what I tend to do is look for those books where I know, okay, here's a character who's been put through some really hard things
mm,
and bears up under it admirably. Maybe this is a good time to introduce them to some of the Christian saints, the biographies
yeah.
of the Christians who have gone through really hard times, because those are so
Mm.
wonderful to read and be like, oh, I guess it isn't so bad if mom asks me to clean my room. Like, maybe
Yeah,
I
that's right.
maybe I can do that.
Maybe I shouldn't lay on the
um,
floor being dramatic about something like as
exactly.
little as that.
Yes,
Yeah.
or or if my son, if I'm sensing that he needs to read about more courageous kids, then I can give him,
Mm,
like Nate Andy Wilson's books. His characters, his boys, go through a lot of really hard things, and so those are great ones to give to boys and be like, look at how these kids went through hard stuff and prevailed and struggled and overcame. And so I do think that, I mean, books are just such powerful tools for shaping our loyalties, for influencing
mm.
morality. And so even when I recommend books, I always say to parents, vet it yourself first, make sure that this is what you want them to be reading.
Yeah. And I think it's really difficult in today's day and age to find good books for your kids, and for yourself even. I remember going to my local library, and I've said this story before on the podcast, and I was like, just curiosity, because we're curious creatures. I'm going to see what's in the kids section, what they're putting out there for children. there was not one book that I would have comfortably hired or lent out or wanted to be made available for any child. Like I
Mm-hmm.
cannot explain, like, not one. And that's not an exaggeration. Everything was plagued in with all these agendas, and they were just so godless.
Mm-hmm.
And not that I expect a secular library to home the books of God and things that would be good, but like there wasn't even an impartial or just a agnostic or it's just a normal story, it was either you're bad because your skin's white, you're an oppressor. It was you invaded this country, so you should be sorry
Mm.
every day for the rest of your life. It's okay to have two mums or two dads. It's okay to touch yourself if you're 5 to explore. I was just like,
Yeah.
I was shocked, right? And this is our state funded taxpayer libraries. And I just left going, you know what? We need to build our own libraries in our own homes. There's just
Mm-hmm.
nothing that is there. And you do almost have to return to those classic literature pieces, like you mentioned, that you would have maybe read. And you and me in our generation maybe we had a little bit more grace, I think, and freedom
I
to be
think
able to
so.
peruse things.
Yep.
Yeah. Would you say there's been a bit of a shift in literature from what it was and what
Oh,
it is now?
absolutely. I mean, it is the thing is that the gatekeepers of the New York literary scene, they know how powerful stories are. And they know that the way to shape loyalties is to get things normalized as early as
Yeah.
possible. The more it's a desensitization, and and also just the power of stories to to change the way we view the world.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, like even when you were saying about it's bad to have white skin or whatever. I was thinking about, I remember this time that I think I've told this story on some podcast also, but when I had I think my 5-year-old, I was eating lunch with him and talking to him, and I said, wouldn't it be so neat if you were walking through the woods and you found a house that was made out of candy? And he goes, no, mama, because there would be a witch inside it that wants to eat children. Like because of
Hansel
the
and
story
Gretel.
of Hansel and Gretel,
Yeah.
knew that this is like a trope in his mind, right? And I think we understand that kids make those types of connections really easily, and it's one of those things where it's not like I'm actually expecting him to find a house made of candy in the woods, but the idea is if you see something alluring and enticing, if a man on the street has a car
Yeah.
and says there's candy inside it, hopefully that same alarm bell will go off,
Mm.
um,
Yeah.
it's the idea of, like, you should not go into a stranger's house. Like that's the takeaway there. And so I think that a lot of the secular literature that's written for children is giving them new and rewritten tropes and
Yeah.
ideas, that so that when they see the world, they're going to make connections in a certain way,
Mm.
just based off what might even seem like innocuous little stories. But
Yeah.
we all know that there's no middle ground. There is no, you can't be writing a story that isn't swaying people's emotions and loves in one way or the other. So
Mm.
I think that, I mean, even just with my experience was trying to get a book published that was essentially too innocent. It was too sweet and quiet for, I guess, what they were wanting to do for
Mm.
children. And it's wild to me because as my agent was saying to me, you need to make your book darker. And I was thinking, here we are as a country bemoaning um, the psychological state of our youth, the amount of mass shootings that we deal with, the
Mm.
suicide rates, all the troubles that we have. And yet, what are we doing? We're asking authors to make their stories darker and
Feeding it.
angrier
Mm.
and more violent. We're feeding it. And then we're so shocked when our children, who we have fed this terrible food, are dying from it. So
Yeah.
it's really a bizarre thing to me.
It is. I think Vodi Borkham made this incredible quote once, and I quote it all the time. I'm probably not going to get it exact, but he said, "We can't continue sending our children off to Caesar and then getting mad when they come back looking like Romans." And,
Right.
it's like that. You're exactly right. Like the world is literally on fire. It's like that Elmo meme, that gif where there's fire and he's got his arms up in the air and he's just
Yes.
like, what's going on? And it's like, here's some more petrol for you to throw on the fire. Let's give the kids more darkness. And it's like, what they need is the light. Like they need
Right.
to, we need to make our children sensitive to evil again. Let's make that the
Yes.
new trend. Let's sensitize our children to evil, because you're
Right.
right. The first step that they do is they desensitize to normalize. And I love that
Hmm.
the tropes that you mentioned. I hadn't made that connection before with such a simple story like Hansel and Gretel, but you're like, yes. But now the tropes that they're making is, oh, when I see someone in school cut off their genitals for tolerance, that I have to accept that and
That's
tolerate. And
empowering. Yes.
exactly. And they're the tropes. And it's crazy how they go after children in every single institution, like every
Hmm.
little facet like of their life. And I think that reading is becoming excuse me, less popular with children, but they're still doing it, because if they can steal one soul from the light and bring it to the dark, that's evil. That they'll do that. And
Hmm.
so you want to normalize reading again for children, but then you also need to normalize again being sensitive to what they're reading. Have
Right.
you noticed as well, off topic a little bit, but have you noticed that children don't like reading as much as they once did? Have you noticed a trend away from books and more so towards maybe the screen or other things?
I think so. I'm really blessed to be in a community here that really values reading and books, and so I have wondered that. I mean, there's a lot of book sales happening nationwide. One thing that I've noticed, and this is again skewing older, but I remember when I was working to get The Winter King sold in New York, my agent told me that the primary consumer of young adult fiction, so fiction written for 12 to 18-year-olds, was 20 to 30-year-old women. So those were the
Okay.
people, that was actually the audience that was
Yeah,
reading young
wow.
adult books. And so I don't know what the teens were reading or if they even were reading, but it was partially sad because I thought, gosh, what is it because 20 to 30-year-old women are wanting sort of that vicarious, you know,
Yeah.
reliving of youth? Or is it just because, I mean, there was a lot that young adult is generally simpler, easier to read. I'm not sure what was going on there, but it struck me as really sketchy. And
Mm.
I think that I think there's still a push for um, kids to read books, because there is the hope again that they'll be reading the right books, depending on what you think is right. But there's definitely it is much harder to keep the attention span of kids,
Yeah.
because they are, especially, it's really sad, but because kids as young as 7 or 8 are being given smartphones, and so they have things like Instagram and TikTok, which are those 10-second reels or
Yeah.
whatever, that give them just that quick dopamine hit, and then they move on to the next one and the next one, and they're not getting the benefit of sitting and reading long form the way that kids used
Mm.
to. And even TV shows and movies tend to be very fast paced and frantic because they're trying so hard to keep attention. So
Mm.
I think that it is something that if you want your kids to be good readers, you do have to be very intentional about it. I mean, we very intentionally limit our kids' screen time, but even just things like, we've always read out loud to our kids from when they were probably too young to understand it, because we wanted that to just be part of the liturgy of their life. We gave them when they outgrew naps but still needed some quiet time, we give them audiobooks to listen to. I had a mom friend once tell me, she just suggested, she was like, just leave piles of books out around the house. It may not be the clean aesthetic that you're looking for in your life, but it's actually like a real big blessing to your kids to just have little stacks here and there. And it's true that if I do that and I kind of rotate through them, my kids, if they're wandering around the house trying to decide what to do, and they see a book they haven't read in a while, they'll pick it up. And next thing I know, they're lounging on the couch reading it. So I think you do have to be more intentional about it, because there was a time when kids were bored and there were no screens, so they would just pick up a book. But now you really do have to make it kind of an intentional and even sometimes enforced part of their routine. So actually for us, we just started summer here. And so instead of, they're not reading like they were at school. So I have as part of their daily list of, things we're going to do. We're doing Bible reading together. We're doing some chores, and I want you to find some time to go sit in the hammock and read. And, you can make it fun. You can give them a lemonade and, a cookie and say, go sit somewhere, just to give them that feeling of like, this is a sweet thing. This is a gift to get to read. But I try to come up with different ways to make it enjoyable. My son, who's 7, he's still in the early reading stage. So sometimes what I'll do with him is we'll read a chapter book, but we'll alternate who's reading which page, so I'll read a page and then he'll read a page, and then it's fun time, to bond with him. And then of course, just finding the books that they like to read. So my 12-year-old loves biographies. That's her favorite thing, which is so funny because I'm the fantasy reader.
Yeah.
And
you got that from her dad, maybe.
Yes, my husband is very much into biographies. So I've been scouring the internet for good, solid biographies for a 12-year-old to read. And then my middle child prefers fantasies. But she doesn't really like animal fantasies yet, or maybe she never will. So I've been trying to find ones that she likes. Anyway, it requires making a good study of your kids and knowing, because there are a lot of options out there, and there actually are a lot of great options. So just figuring out what ones are going to really hit them and make them love reading. Because I think that's the important goal is, I don't mind, especially in the summer, if they're reading slightly below their age level or whatever, because they just want to binge through something. What I'm wanting is to give them that love of reading, as opposed to just being like, oh no, but you should be reading Tolstoy right now because that's an academic, novel or whatever. So
definitely. And I think this is something that I guess I'm a living product of. My parents never really instilled much reading for us kids. We were a very sport orientated family. My family members have represented our country in the Olympics. So this is what we had to compete with, right? If you didn't do good in sports, like you have no value. So it was like we were very get up early, train. And they were very disciplined in those things. So that was our normal. But reading wasn't really normalized. And it was only when I was in high school, I started to pique a bit of an interest. And funny enough, Harry Potter came out at that time, and I took that upon myself and took the initiative to read it. And I binged through and I'd never read before, but I read it cover to cover, every single one of them, and fell in love with, I guess you could call that fantasy, not real world stuff. And then from there, I think I read this book called Winter by, is it Marsden? And it was a bit of a dark sort of story and a bit shocking, but I quite liked it. It was on the thriller side of things. And this was me in high school, just sort of exploring and figuring out what I liked. And then from there, I started getting into biographies, interesting enough. There was one called Princess, I think it's by Jean P. Sasson or something. And she did a whole series about this Middle Eastern princess who was oppressed. And I just read these stories nonstop, all these books, and I just got so hungry for it. And I absolutely fell in love with reading. And that was my own initiative without having that from my parents. But then I joined the police at 18, and that changed everything. I didn't have time to read. And if I had time off, I was sleeping because I was tired, or my mind was filled with other evils of the world, I was like, I don't have time for reading a story. And so I sort of fell out of reading. And I think it was because my parents never took the initiative to make it a habit for me, that
Mm,
when I was directed elsewhere, I lost some of that. And so something
mm,
that I really would love to do with my own family, and something how I would love to raise my children, like, would be taking the initiative and making it a habit to read. And like you said, I think you need to teach children not only to read well and to have good grammar and to write well and to articulate and all that, but teach them to love to read. And I think that's truly where the skill is as a parent, to teach your children to love reading. And I love my
yes.
parents, but that's something they didn't do. And it's something that, like, now I have such a desire for information, but I have a terrible habit now of picking up a book and getting so into it and finishing half of it and then putting it down and then forgetting it and then going,
Mm.
oh, what have I done? And I hate that in myself, right? I hate it in myself. And so that's like, I want to do better for my kids in the future. And
Yeah.
yeah, definitely
It
create
really is a
healthy
habit.
habits.
It's a habit that you have to cultivate. And anymore, it does. It takes so much work because our phones are such a
Yeah,
distraction. And so
yeah.
I've even gotten to the point where I'll put my phone in the other room while I'm reading so that I'm not tempted if I see a text message or whatever, I want to really be able to cultivate that the ability to focus on just one thing and
Yeah.
follow a line of reasoning or a plot or whatever, and not get so distracted by, I mean, we have so many distractions, and there really is something
Mm.
just wonderful about getting lost in a book for a couple hours. And I think it's a really, so for me, this is something I suggest to a lot of people, because I do this. My husband and I do this at night, but they of course they have all the studies that show that it's really bad to be on your phone right before bed. So we
Mm.
try to put our phones away, and then we both read for 20 to 30 minutes every night in bed. And I think that doing that actually really does help wind your brain down and help you
Mm.
sleep better. And it also just helps you get through a lot of books. Now, I do have some friends who some of my girlfriends have said, oh, I could never do that, because if I started the book, I would not put it down until
Yeah.
I had finished it. And it'd be 4 a.m. or something. So I don't know if it would work for everyone, but I really do think, and I try to get my kids to do that too. Like, I think it's just a really, again, the liturgy of it. It's a nice way to end the day and to unwind.
Mm.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. I've heard a lot of people do that. I have a friend from my old church. Her and her husband do the same thing. They have a pile of books next to their bed, and every night they just do that. And I always have great intentions, Christine. I'm like, this is what I'm going to do, and
All
then
right.
I'll be trapped in some serial killer documentary, and I'll just
Oh
be
no.
watching it, and it's midnight, and I'm like, oh, I better go. And then I'll go to bed and plug my phone and go, I'll just check notifications one more
Yep.
time. And then it's like, it really, you have to be so disciplined. And I'm
Yes.
rebuking myself as I'm speaking to you right now. This is something I need to rebuke myself. I need to do better at this, because I think, you know, how the parents are is often how the children are. And if I'm
Right.
undisciplined in this, how am I expected to discipline my children in this, or, my household in this? It's something I need to sort out first and foremost, I think, before I try to push that on anyone else. So if
Right.
anything comes of
Yeah, it's a
today, I've rebuked
self-control.
myself. Thank you.
Oh, good. Maybe
It's
tonight you'll, find that book on the bedstand and crack it open before bed. And
yeah. I'll message you and go, thank you, Christine. I did it.
yes,
I did it. It'd be like the
it's my goal.
Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm day one sober of actually
Yes.
reading a book before bed. So yeah,
This will
that'll
be
be
my
good.
inheritance to the nations, is getting everyone reading it in bed at
Yes.
night.
Yes, that is good. That is goals right there.
Yep.
Right there. But look, you do a lot of talks about getting into fiction, and you do a lot of, I guess you like to teach and help people, I guess, write for themselves. And I was saying this before we pressed record and we went live, is that I have so many ideas in my head and so many things that I think that would be a great story, but I don't even have the first clue how to put it to paper. You kind of help people bridge that gap a little bit. Can you explain that side of what you do?
Yeah. So yes, this will be my official plug for the MFA program at New St. Andrews, because it's a low residency 2-year MFA program, and what it is it's called Camperdown. If you're trying to find it, I think it's camperdownmfa.com. And what I realized was that I love helping people finish a novel. So it's the easiest thing in the world to start a novel. And this is something that
Mm,
many people do, is you get an idea and you're really excited about it. And it's sort of like the honeymoon stage of a marriage where everything's rosy and nothing could go wrong. And then you hit, I don't know, 10,000 words or whatever, or the first roadblock, and you suddenly are like, this is not fun anymore. And now I want to stop. And I think the part of it is that we tend to view art as something we should enjoy. It's like a hobby, and even writing is that way. And so we think to
mm,
ourselves, okay, well, if I'm not enjoying it, then I shouldn't be writing. Like I should only write. I should only sit down and write when I feel like it. And I try to help people do the mindset shift of realizing that this is a career. This is your work. And so there are going to be days when you don't feel like showing up to the keyboard to write. And you
mm,
really do just have to push through that. So a lot of writing is that same self-control. It's the same diligence of saying like, okay, yes, I'm at a tough part, but I'm not just going to abandon it and try to write something new. I'm going to push through, because you can't fix something you haven't written. So one of the things that we do with the MFA program is it's when you graduate, you will have completed a novel. So that's kind of the prerequisite for
mm.
graduation is hopefully you've written the entire first draft and had a chance to do one round of edits on it. And so the pep talk that I give to the students is, if you write 500 words a day, which is not very many words, it's actually it's fairly simple to get 500 words down. They don't even have to be good words. They just have to be words that are moving the plot forward. You can get a novel written if you take off Sundays. You can get a novel written in like 3 to 4 months. And it's shocking how quickly those words just pile up. Like with anything else, it's just the consistency. It's showing up at the keyboard. And sometimes what I find is if I give people that 500 word minimum, they'll start writing. And this happens to me a lot. I'll start writing and it's like pulling teeth and I'm really hating it. And I'm thinking, why did I choose this career path? And then I get to about word number 480 and suddenly it starts rolling. And the next thing I know, I've written 1,500 words that night,
Mm.
so there is something about the fact that God blesses diligence and doing something even when you don't feel like it, and then hoping and praying that the emotion will come later. And
Yeah.
that happens a lot with writing, where it's like you almost have to just sweat through those first couple hundred words each day, and then it really takes off. But I would love to see more Christians writing really
Yes.
good books, and so that was part of the reason I accepted the director position, was because I want to be able to get people from an idea in their head to a finished first draft, and the confidence to be able to do that over and over again, because it might not be a publishable book that they come out of the program with. Like I said, I've actually thrown away 3 whole novels, maybe 4. I think 3. And that's okay, because I needed to write them in order to know what I was doing wrong, in order to learn and
Mm.
get better. And it's a craft. It takes time to get good at it. But yes, I would love to see more Christians who really understand how telling a good story is going to shape children and adults.
Mm.
And yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I would love to see more Christians step up into these. I would say that literature almost falls under the banner of entertainment. Like it is something that you do to entertain yourself in some way. And I feel like we've
Yes.
almost just thrown the white flag up, put our hands up and gone, okay, Satan, you can have this domain, because we've almost
Mhm.
given up on our movies, on like it's just trash when you look at it. And there are a few, like, incredible Christian people who are trying to fill that void, like Law TV. They're trying to get a lot of people to take initiative with creating Christian films, and not those G grade, I hate to say it, you know, worse than Hallmark sort of quality, like good quality Christian films that you can enjoy, that's on par with what Hollywood's producing. And
Right.
you see a lot of people who are starting to write children's books again, who are starting to do all this, who are Christian, who come from that Christian foundation, which is great, because there is such a gaping void in that area of entertainment for Christian families. And I would love to see more Christians, yeah, put things in a book for us to read for
Mhm.
our fulfillment and enjoyment, because God is a good God. He wants us to get fulfillment from these things. Like, these are all good. They're not all
Right.
inherently bad. It's like we're so conditioned to think that enjoying a movie or a book is bad, because it is kind of so worldly. But if we could create it in as part of our Christian world, that
Mhm.
always points back to the revelation of God in some way or another, similar to how C.S. Lewis did with his Narnia series, and Tolkien did, and you've done in yours. Like, it, even though it's fantasy and it's not the Bible, it still points to God's nature and
Right.
his revelation. I would love that so much if more people did that, and we had, more options at our fingertips. Wouldn't
Right. Well,
that's
and
part of
God himself
Christendom?
uses, I mean, he uses all the great literary tools in scripture, typology and foreshadowing and metaphors and
Mm,
similes, and Jesus instructs with parables. And so I think,
yeah.
yeah, if we're imitating God, we should be using stories to teach and to instruct. And I think that, like you were saying about the subpar movies, and we have that in Christian literature too, where either Christians are worried about showing true darkness, so they don't, the stories have this kind of strange glow about them where it's like
Yeah.
there's not really evil because we believe in God, and there, how could there be evil in the world that God's created? And it's like, oh well, have you stepped outside your front door recently?
Yeah.
And so, my stories are, they're they're heavy. There's a lot of darkness in them. Um, but I'm always showing at the end, or trying to show the light and the fact that good triumphs and that evil is going to lose. And so I think that Christians, they need to, yeah, be careful not to sugarcoat their stories, because then they're unbelievable and no one takes them seriously, because
Mm,
we know, oh, okay, people actually are bad and they do bad things. And so when
yeah.
you're telling me kind of a lie in this fairy tale, sugar plum world you've created. And then on the other side of things, it's, the um Christians will say, oh, well, it's only a Christian story if the main character has an actual conversion at the end. Like if we see
Mm,
them, you know, being baptized, and if God is actually explicitly mentioned and all this, and for one thing, it's like, well, we have the entire book of Esther, which is
mm,
a beautifully written story in the Bible that
yeah.
doesn't, we hear Esther, I think it says she fasts and prays, but it's like God is not, quote unquote, is not mentioned in the story.
Mm,
It's like, it's a really great example of being able to show a redemptive arc and real danger and real darkness, and do it in a way that isn't, I guess, what we would call preachy. And so
yeah.
I think that's another thing we're looking for, is Christians who understand that the world is God breathed, and because of that, if you tell a story that tells the truth about the world, then it's going to be a Christian story.
Mm,
And so you don't have to put like a little cross on top of everybody's heads to show like these are the good guys and then these are the bad
yeah.
guys. Like, you can just tell a good story and trust that God will use that, to
Mm,
mold and shape people and for His glory.
yeah. Well, it's like, yeah, like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, like they don't actually, yeah, like Aslan, sure, is a representative or a figure of Christ, right? And then,
Hmm.
but most of the time, good and evil is like inherited in our natures. You just kind of know what's good and what's evil. And that's part of, our inherited nature is we're born with the knowledge of good and evil, like we are.
Mhm.
Which is why you can, even in countless civilizations that have never really been colonized or taken over by Christianity, they still, you can go into those groups of people and they still have this like weird fear of a god. They even though they've never been shaped by the gospel yet. Like you see tribes and stuff in the Amazon jungle and natives from countries that have an understanding and inherited knowledge of God, even though they don't understand
Right.
it. And good versus evil. It's inside of us, which is why basic stories, when I mean basic, I don't mean in detail. I mean basic is in the concept good versus evil. That's why they're the most successful, because it's inherited in our natures to want good to prevail over evil, which is why the whole Tolkien, I found that whole fantasy series, it was just a fight of good versus evil, and the light always
Mhm.
won and prevailed. It didn't have Jesus being crucified on the cross. It didn't have those things, but it did point back to Christ's like nature and our inherited
Right.
good versus evil. So I totally understand what you're saying there. And yeah, I think that storytelling doesn't need to have those exact things, or you're doing it in injustice. I think that you can point to the revelation of God through, ideas and things that draw out our nature, which is, even if you look at Hollywood now, the most successful films of 2022, the last couple of years, was the new Top Gun movie and the new Super
Mhm.
Mario movie for kids. And you're like, why? And it's like, okay, well, it was Top Gun. It was good versus bad. There was nothing woke in it. Masculinity and
Right.
patriarchy was a good thing, which is not seen today. And why was the Mario movie? The Mario movie wasn't that great, but it played on nostalgia for our generation. And there's just nothing. It was just good versus
It wasn't
evil.
trying to be woke. Yep.
It just was a base, and I was like, that wasn't even that great of a story, but I loved it because it was just good versus evil, and it
Right.
was simple. And I think, yeah, like I would love literature to be detailed, but just stick to those simple ideas, good versus evil. And good always points to the revelation of God and his nature. And that always
Mhm.
wins. That always trumps over evil.
Right.
Yeah. Now, moving forward, can you give us, me and the audience, any hints as to whether you're writing any stories at the moment, or you're going to release any? Do we get a little sneak preview of your brilliant mind and how it's working?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm in kind of a funny spot because um I have two books that I've written since The Sinking City that have not yet gone out into the world. So I have a another fairy tale that's excuse me. It's a Welsh fairy tale, and I wrote it for my kids. I wrote it with my kids actually. I would read them a chapter at night, and then they would give me feedback and tell me
That's
what
so
they wanted to
awesome.
see happen, which was really fun.
I love
So that
that.
one's
Yeah.
actually, yeah. And I wrote it. I meant for it to read as a read aloud, so it's simpler, it's shorter. So I'm still tweaking that one. I haven't sent it off to my editor at Canon yet. And then what I actually did is I wrote another novel that is so this one would be considered middle grade. So that's for the 8 to 12-year-olds group. And I wrote it, and I signed with a different literary agent, and we're going to try to shop that one out to New York houses in the next, well, whenever I can get it to her. I'm doing
Yep.
the I she had me do some revisions on it, and it's funny because coming back around full circle to having an agent again is kind of strange. But I hadn't yet given up on the dream of getting something published in New York, because I do think that there are still wonderful editors there, and I think
Mm.
you can reach a whole different audience that way. So I view it kind of like cross pollination. If I can get people reading books that I publish in New York, hopefully that'll send them back to Canon Press to read my
Yeah,
other, my first books,
absolutely.
and vice versa. So, but actually, it was Andy Wilson, Nate. His suggestion to me was try writing something slightly younger, right, for the middle grade audience. See if that's if that might be an easier sell in terms of marketability. So we'll
Yes.
see. So that one, I'm almost finished with my edits on it. I'm feeling the tug of, I also have, next week is our, so the MFA program meets 3 weeks out of the year.
Yeah.
So we meet once in February, once in June, and once in October for 2 years. And you just get like a week-long intensive classes. So anyway, so I have that next week, and I'm trying to get my lectures ready for that. And it's and then of course I have 3 children and a house and a very large dog, and I'm finding
a husband
and a husband, and everything is, and he's an entrepreneur, so we've got businesses going, and it's all good things. But I'm always having to make sure that my desires are aligned correctly, because the temptation, I think, of any writer is to be like, I'm just going to go off into the woods and write, and no one will disturb me, and I will get this out there into the world. But that is not the way God, he's given me many wonderful baskets full of fruit, and I need to make sure that I'm holding all of them and not dropping anything. So at this point, I don't have anything like on the docket ready to go, but I'm hopeful that I will be able to announce something in the next year or so. We shall see.
I'm very excited, and hopefully you're cultivating the birth of 3 of your offspring who might also, you'll get a very analytical biographer, maybe writer, and then you might have a fantasy one, and we're still yet to know with the 7-year-old, I think.
Yes.
But we might have 3 little Christian authors out there who are also contributing to our bookshelves and our home library. So that would be fantastic. But I'm really excited for what you're doing in the future. Would you ever consider writing adult fantasy? Is that something that would be on your agenda, or you sort of stick to more youth and children?
I actually I would never say never. I have thought about writing adults, and I'm not sure if I would do fantasy or something completely different. Maybe just something more modern. I don't know. This is what happens is I read a lot of books, and I read pretty widely in genres. And so I'll read something and I'll think, oh, I want to write that type of story, and so I'm not really sure, but I would love to write. I'd love to try my hand at it. I think there's certain types of fantasy that are really complicated and complex, and I'm actually just not sure if I'm an accomplished enough writer yet to do that. And so I'm sort of, with each book, I try to do something a little different or a little bit harder, or, so I actually have really broken my brain with my current one that I'm working on with my editor, because it's a heist, which I've never done. And as it turns out, you have to be as clever as the people you're writing about. So I'm trying to come up with, a heist idea that's, it's a lot, but
well, look,
anyway.
if you ever need someone who's got some inside knowledge on being an undercover operative, you hit me up. I can put your mind in the mind of that. maybe
that actually would be wonderful. I will take you up on that, I'm sure.
Maybe all those years of my life won't be wasted after all. I could live vicariously through your characters and all those experiences. But
I'd love that.
It's been an absolute pleasure having you on here. I would love to point people in a direction where they can purchase your books, or where they could follow you along, or perhaps even inquire if they're interested in that MFA program that you have. So if you don't mind sharing that.
Oh, sure. Okay. So let's see. My website is Christine D as in Delta Cohen.com. So ChristineDCohen.com, and on there I actually have I have a sign up link for a newsletter, which I do once a month, and I talk about what I'm working on and what books I'm reading. So I do reading recommendations, and I also have on my website a whole page that's different book recommendations for different reading levels.
Oh, good.
Yes, and then I'm pretty much only on Instagram, and I think it's Christine Cohen author. I think that's what I should know that, but I'm pretty sure if you search for Christine Cohen author, you could find me on Instagram. And then the MFA program is just Camperdown, and that's CAMPERDOWN MFA.com. But honestly, if you just Googled my name and some keywords, I'm sure you'd find what you're looking for. And you can get my books through, if you want to support a smaller, local business, you can get them through canonpress.com. But I know it's harder with overseas, and so you can also find them on Amazon. Either way.
Yep, great, amazing. And I do hope and encourage would like to encourage the audience listening today to go and do that, to support Christian authors. We're always pointing and complaining. Here's how we live it out. We actually be better and do better, and that's supporting Christian authors who are in there, who are giving us alternatives to the rot that we're seeing in the world around us. But it's been such an honor having you on here. Thank you for joining me. And next time you release a book or something, you let me know, because I would love to promote it and share it and get it out there for people. So
thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This was so much fun.